Welcome to our sixth episode of Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling, a collection of Asian Pacific Islander social work voices. Hi, I'm Chris Lum,
And I'm Francis Joseph Gallego.
and we are Asian Pacific Islander social workers from the Bay Area. We are here to create a safe space to uplift Asian American Pacific Islander social work voices, stories, and experiences across diverse communities and spaces.
Thank you, Chris. The bamboo ceiling refers to the invisible barriers that limit Asian and Pacific Islander social workers from advancing into leadership roles. Despite high qualifications, Asian Pacific Islanders hold only 6% of senior positions in sectors like government and nonprofits, far below their workforce representation.
Today, we will be interviewing Michael Liao. Michael has been working in the human service field since 2001 and received his Master's of Social Work degree from UC Berkeley in 2006. For the past 20 years, he has been working as the Director of Program and Training at NICO's Chinese Health Coalition, where he utilizes meso and macro social work interventions to effect systemic change in order to promote the health and well-being of San Francisco's Chinese and broader Asian American communities. Michael's areas of interest include youth development, empowerment, mental health, and addictive disorders, and community-driven collective impact frameworks. And thanks, Mike.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's so good to see you. We've known each other for a while.
Yes, Princess knows all my secrets, so I'm only feeling slightly vulnerable.
Vulnerability is such a privilege and a gift. And we're just so grateful. Chris and I are so grateful that you're, blessing us with your presence and just allowing us to learn so much about you and the amazing work you do for our shared community. So thank you so much. Um, you
Thank you.
know, our first question, is that can you just please share with our audience about your personal journey? Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences or just people or role models that have influenced your path into social work that inspired you to become the leader you are today?
Yeah. Having been in the field for about 25 years, I've obviously, during my, career path in social work, I've had a lot of wonderful mentors and folks who have shaped, who I am today. But it's kind of interesting because even before I knew about the social work profession, I actually learned as a child about advocacy, about systemic changes from my own mom. My mom early on really taught me, how to use a critical lens to look at the world in order to see inequities, disparities. One of the things that she taught me early on was, paying attention to how certain groups and communities are portrayed, and you know, and how a lot of that is created through, like for example, growing up in Taiwan, a lot of the pop culture media, TVs and movies, when they would portray people who had bad intentions, or people who were portrayed as unsophisticated or educated, they would always be portrayed as speaking Taiwanese, which is the dialect that we spoke growing up, while all the protagonists and heroes would be speaking Mandarin. And she used that as an example to highlight that a lot of times, these perceptions or portrayals of groups of people are socially constructed and often tinged with personal bias and stereotypes. And she also was one of the first people to, help me realize that there's so much inequities in the world, that there are a lot of folks who have an abundance while, folks struggle to get by. And so she really taught me early on about the importance of using our voices to call attention to these issues and to enact an intention to, or enact an intention to make change. And so, it's kind of interesting that looking back, you know, although I didn't know about the field of social work until I was in my 20s, it was kind of almost inevitable, I think, for me to go into social work because at such a young age, my mom already imbued me with, all of these social work principles and values of, fighting for equity and justice and, using a systemic lens to look at the world's issues and problems.
I want to say thank you for bringing that up because you bring up an important point about not just fighting for equity and change, but the importance of narrative and story, right? And the
Yeah.
importance of just how our own role models can come from our family, and our own role
Yeah.
models can come from people we know, and the importance of elevating those voices and those stories. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, I remember you and I had so many conversations about the roles of our mothers played and, our respective, you know, career paths and the reasons why we wanted to get into the helping profession. So,
I remember that too. Thank you for sharing your story with us.
Yeah, thanks. Next question, I'm excited to ask about this question is
mhm.
'cause there's so many, I mean, barriers we talk about that APIs face in their career path
Hmm.
to go into social work. What did you face any barriers in embarking in your career as social work, and um, was there anything you learned to help overcome these or navigate through them or face these challenges?
I mean, I wonder if I'm one of the weird, rare, lucky ones because I felt like I've had such kind of like a easy, not easy, but like a fairly smooth path to the career of social work. I have a wonderful Asian mom who fully embraced and supported my venture into first psychology and later social work. I do have extended family members that sometimes still sort of aren't too sure, like, what exactly it is that I do. But, I felt like I've had a really kind of like great career, great job opportunities over my 25 years of human service field. I feel like maybe what worked in my favor was kind of this clarity early on of what I wanted to do, right? I kind of mentioned a little bit already of how my mom instilled a lot of those values early on. And then it wasn't until about college, my undergrad, when I really, grabbed on to, this as a potential possible career, when I first discovered psychology and then sociology. And then I had a really wonderful mentor in at San Jose State, which where I went for undergrad. She was a community psychologist, and I really looked up to her and aspired to be like her. And having met her, she really helped me sort of set a course early on to reach my eventual goal of doing something similar to what she was doing, like community driven work, systems change work. And so ultimately I knew I wanted to become a social worker, and specifically working in a nonprofit setting as a as a leader, as an administrator. So I think these are the reasons why I feel so passionate about mentorship, mentoring the next generations of you know social workers, helping professions. I really love, hosting learners and interns at my job at Nikos and being able to foster and develop the next generation of social workers. And I also really believe very strongly in creating those pipelines even earlier, having ethnic studies, Asian American studies, psychology, social work kind of offerings in schools, like high schools, so that we could expose young people early on to visible representation of these careers, to see people who are thriving in these kind of jobs, who are making a positive impact, that are doing meaningful work, and at the same time earning a living that they could survive on, right? I think that's really important, to be able to do that for Asian American young people, because our jobs aren't as glamorized, aren't as highlighted, but yet there's a lot of value and worth to it. And we need to be able to have more role models and spokespeople to be able to disseminate that.
Hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. If I could ask a little question also, did we when we talk about career paths, sometimes the um, trying to meet the family. You mentioned kind of like the glamorous, right? And myself, I encounter that kind of struggle, right? Where like it's just meeting the expectations
Yeah,
of what an API
right,
uh,
right.
person should be following, right? Engineering, doctor, right? Did any of that ever come across the barrier in your path?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe a part of kind of my luck was that a lot of folks within my family were already more kind of along the arts and humanities kind of side of things. My mom was a piano teacher. She was really big on music. She had siblings who are artists and teachers. So, kind of that blending of using art and education is what I do now and a lot of the work that I do. And so, I feel like it's kind of been in my family's DNA. So maybe my family is a little unique in that sense, that everyone was sort of into non-traditional, like if we're talking about more
Yeah.
stereotypical
Hmm.
Asian American careers or Asian careers, they really weren't in those. But I certainly can see, just growing up around other Asian Americans, that there's a lot of pressures to be in, like the typical finance or STEM or other kinds of fields. And I think, when all of the options or role models you see are from those very select, narrow few, options, it really limits your horizon and what you think it's possible, right? So that's why I think it's so important to have more representation and role modeling, especially early on.
Yeah. Thank you.
Michael, we've known each other for such a long time, and I remember working when you first met, working together. Lucky Asian Americans for community involvement and
Yeah.
the importance of representation, right? The importance for working for these programs that offer culturally humble services and the creation of safe spaces to have for the populations that we work with, right? To have these safe spaces to talk about these issues that are so important for us. And I think our next question kind of talks about what you first brought up also is like these messaging that your mom first talked about like like who are the voices being talked about in the room, right? And
Yeah,
what voices
right.
are being honored and shared and
Right.
who's not being listened to. So as a leader now, you've been in with Nikos for about 20 years, am I correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how have you challenged like these different either colonial norms or cultural norms in social work, such as like hierarchy or productivity or professionalism, while still like navigating either dealing with institutional power or different other hierarchies?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's so timely and but also a really challenging one and complex one. I'm not sure if, I necessarily have arrived at all the answers, and I don't know if that's how that works.
Hmm.
But I think I'll share kind of two things that
Hmm.
I've I've worked on and are still working on to sort of understand that and implement that in my work. I think for me, number one is that a lot of the work has to start from within.
Hmm.
I really love this quote from Black feminist scholar Audre Lorde. I
Hmm.
printed it out so that make sure I say it verbatim. But the true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations that we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us. And that quote resonates with me because for me, it has been sort of a need for this constant ongoing process of self discovery and sort of learning and unlearning my own internalized colonial mentality, some of which I may not even always consciously realize I have and hold. So part of that could range from, just being more attuned to my own internalized white or Eurocentrism, my internalized racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, etc., right? but I think also sort of trying to be more cognizant as a social worker of, you know, some of the ways that I may have either actively or passively reinforced different oppressive carceral systems, like the child welfare system,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think our profession of social work unfortunately has had a long history of sort of almost being synonymous with colonial,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
systems and practices, right? That often exists for the purpose of controlling, surveilling,
Mm-hmm.
and criminalizing, especially disproportionately, the folks that we serve,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Communities of color, LGBTQ plus communities, and other marginalized communities. And so, I think my second thing that I wanted to share was that a lot of these, as a leader within the social workspace, I think a lot of these critical self-reflections ultimately must also translate to organizational, cultural, and systemic conversations, right, within our workspaces, within systems of care that we exist in, having conversations about, things like how do we, as social workers who are promoting health and wellness, how are we, balancing productivity versus self-care with our staff, with our interns, as organizations and systems, how are we grappling with the use of unpaid or underpaid labor, like student interns, right? Especially with in light of like lack of funding. And also, how do we practice social work in a way that doesn't contribute to the over policing of people and bodies of the people that we're supposedly, trying to help, right? I think all of those are really key conversations. And again, I'm not saying I have answers to all of those because even at Nikos, we're grappling with some of those issues ourselves. But I think having, again, to recap, having that process of critical self reflection, but then also making sure to translate that to hopefully larger, broader, macro systemic changes is really critical. And those are for good first steps.
I pause and reflect on, the conversations we used to have back in
Yeah.
2001 and how, one of the things we always used to talk about was about the importance of intersectionality, right?
Yeah.
And the importance of always also us as Asian and Pacific Islanders, how, the importance of not just challenging either implicit bias, but also anti-blackness and
Right.
also like the model minority myth and how we can work together with other either BIPOC communities or
Right.
communities of color,
That's right.
right?
Yeah.
And I know we used to have all those conversations also because I think it is also about how we can work together with other communities, especially when, social work is founded on white saviorism,
Right.
right?
Right.
And how we
That's
can
right.
work in dealing with all these like working with other social workers in terms of how we can work together in terms of in systems that sometimes don't work with us. And I'm glad you
Yeah.
talked also about mentorship and
Yeah.
points of representation, right? And the
Mm.
points of all these different things and dealing with systems that can be very frustrating at times. And
Yeah.
thank you so much for bringing that up.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, next question. Or just I was gonna think, a lot we're talking about, there's like a quote that be the change you want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And really, yeah, being the change that we want to be. Next question is, sometimes, we talk about these cultural barriers, and I can relate to, times, it can be scary to rock the boat.
Yeah.
Um, did you ever feel any pressure earlier in your career to assimilate or stay quiet? And if so, what did you wish someone had said to you to help navigate those cultural barriers?
Yeah, I mean, I think as an Asian American, I think I felt that as a student and as a learner. And, it changed a bit when I became a social worker because, I then was trained and equipped with the tools to say, this is now kind of my mandate to speak up, to use my voice. I think as Asian Americans in general and as immigrants or descendants of immigrants, like you said, Chris, often we, don't want to be, the one to stick out or to be the squeaky wheel, and we want to conform and fit in. As an immigrant, I felt those pressures too, and I think what helped me overcome a lot of that was kind of, again, my undergraduate studies in psychology and sociology, which really helped me sort of take what I learned as a child and what my mom taught me and operationalize it to know that a lot of the social norms and a lot of societal messaging about how we have to be as a man, as a woman, as a Asian American, as an immigrant, as an American, or and so forth. All of that is constructed socially, and that we all play a role in sort of changing the narrative, right? In dismantling things that aren't working and in reshaping that. And so, I felt like that really helped me sort of think of my role in that I have to contribute to this collective sort of correct collective narrative making, right? I that is something that I think, Francis, you brought up this early on in our career. We participated in many mainstream LGBTQ queer forums to share our stories of our intersectional identities of being both queer and Asian American, because we felt like that was a voice that was missing, especially from mainstream queer community, even in the Bay Area. And that's kind of an example of us sort of bringing all of our identities to the forefront and elevating our voices. I mean, that is something that I hope the next generation of API social workers can sort of learn sooner rather than later, is that their unique voices matter. And what makes a good social worker is our intersections, right? That the more we bring our full selves to our practice, to our different spaces, the more we sort of practice, being comfortable in our skin and being our most authentic selves. We are in a way role modeling for our clients, what it looks like to love ourselves, to accept ourselves. And that is really a key step in any kind of healing, right? And so I think that's really important, that I hope future API, young social work, and next generations will sort of take to heart.
And to give some context, 20 years ago, Michael and I, we would do panels around San Jose and talk about our experiences
Yeah.
being queer API and do panels with other queer API. And the reason why we did that was because there was not a space. There is unfortunately within the LGBTQI community, it's usually very white and very gay and very rich. And to have like a narrative that's either Asian bound or immigrant, right, first generation, working
Yeah.
class,
Yeah.
I think, and the different diversity of voices, right, and the
Yeah.
different diversity of experiences, either of acceptance or coming out. And you bring up a very key word, authenticity,
Mm.
because I think the beauty of authenticity, right? And I've shared this also. Me and Chris have had these conversations too within the API social, the council, is that, the beauty of authenticity, right? I think it's like, especially with mentorship or speaking of voices, is embracing all of who we are, even the
Mm.
parts that make us uncomfortable.
Right.
Because I
Yeah.
think when we're able to embrace all of who we are, even the parts that we may be the most ashamed about,
Mm.
there's such a power in that representation, and there's such a power in being able to maybe, if someone's watching, can also see that too, because
Yeah.
shame and stigma, unfortunately, are parts of our culture, right? That can be detrimental. So when we're able to show that the opposite of shame and stigma is connection, right? The opposite of trauma is connection, and being able to show that to someone else can be quite healing, like what you said. So thank you so much, Michael, for being the example for our communities. So thank you so
I
much.
love that. I love that. Thank you,
Yeah,
Francis.
Yeah.
thanks.
On the next question, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, Chris. Sorry. So I think this comes down to more like, I think, for future social workers who may be listening to this.
Hmm.
Like how can new API social workers build courage and credibility while still holding on to human and collective values rooted in their cultures?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of along the lines of what we were saying earlier, sometimes I think, Asian Americans and especially those who are younger, who are early in their careers, feel like, oh, I have nothing to contribute, or that, what I say may not matter. And I've also noticed just in my many, my couple of decades of mentoring and overseeing student learners and folks who are early in their social work careers is that a lot of young API folks tend to undersell themselves. They tend to have a hard time sort of accepting, like, even I still do to this day have a hard time accepting accolades. When I get compliments, I'm like, oh, that's really uncomfortable. Let's move on. Let me deflect. And so I really had to learn to sit with it, right? To sort of be like, why are you like that? And so I really had to learn how to talk myself up, and kind of overcome those fears of like, am I being braggy, or like, am I, am I being arrogant? But I think many of us grow up right with sort of the cultural conditioning, and that socialization is so entrenched in us of humility, of being humble, of not talking about yourself, and we're also so, like you mentioned, we're so collectivist. We tend to relegate successes to the collective. When we work on the project that is with the team, we tend to underplay or diminish our contributions and sort of let other people get their flowers, right? And so, I think for me, again, always I'm using multiple, like, I like to use sort of the two-prong approach. Like on an individual level, I think young API social workers could really learn to find a happy medium, right? To at the same time honor our cultural values and cultural teachings of being humble, but also at the same time finding ways that you feel comfortable to sell yourself to prospective employers, to community partners and stakeholders. I see it as kind of like learning how to be either bilingual or bicultural, right? You're kind of learning how to navigate fluidly between two worlds. And sometimes you might have to code switch a bit in order to be more engaging and effective in a particular setting, right? I mean, I think that's unfortunate that we have to do that, but I think, it's kind of learning how to, navigate different worlds and spaces. But I think also on the other hand, there has to be a organizational, cultural, and systemic sort of accountability too, right? Like I think especially in academia, within helping professions, there has to be conversations of how are we being more accommodating and responsive to different communication styles.
Mhm.
That just because a young Asian American student is always viewed as quiet or silent doesn't mean that they don't have something to say, doesn't mean that they don't have something to contribute. How are you as a system and institution creating other opportunities for people to share in ways that they feel more comfortable with, right? I've been doing trainings for several decades, and I'm always conscientious of how do we use different formats and methods and ways for different learners with different preferred communication styles to share, to have their voices heard, right? Only then could we have true diversity of voices, right? If we're expecting everyone to participate and contribute and excel in only one way, then you're really not going to, elevate everyone equitably,
Mhm.
right?
Well, you bring up a key word, right? Equity, right? It's about equity. It's about creating safe spaces, creating brave spaces, for the people we work with.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, you really share like sounds like the work we do in supervision to talk about our biases, our countertransference, but also understand like you mentioned, as a clinician is walking the path, I was never really, taught, like to understand, that I'm going to have to look at, where my bias is in my cultural backgrounds. And yeah, I really appreciate that. Um,
I mean, if I could just add one more thing, I mean, I think, in our world, in this Western world, what do we value? We value people who are direct. We value people who speak their mind. And all of those things is just a particular narrow set of expressions.
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone prefers to express that way. And I think a lot of times we sort of kind of maybe put the onus on Asian American young people to say like, oh, y'all need to speak up more, like y'all too passive and quiet. But yet it's also the fact that the system is not responsive to all different types of communication. I remember, one of the things we like to talk about in on our panels back then with Francis was that, one of the stories I share is that coming out for queer Asians might look different. That
Mm-hmm.
that queer Asian Americans might use less direct ways of coming out. My husband to this day hasn't officially come out to his mom, but mainly for preserving that family harmony, and also she's older and more frail and may not be able to accept that as easily, and so rather than throwing it in her face, it's more like silently understood. Like, well, this is, the person I've been living with for the past 20 or so years. This is a person that, is going to take care of you when you come visit. And so there's that silent acknowledgement. So not every kind of communication has to be verbal for it to be valid, for it to be, worthwhile, right? And so I think that's also partly, my thought.
yeah.
Well, you bring up the importance of cultural humility, right? The importance of cultural humility and context, and how things are communicated differently, in different
Yeah,
cultures.
right,
Thank you
right.
for
Yeah.
bringing that up.
Yeah. And yeah, I appreciate that. Our next question, is going into, just, leadership
Ah,
and legacy and offering hope to future leaders. What kind of leadership do you hope the next generation API social workers will practice differently than your own generation had to?
yeah, a lot. I think that COVID, the pandemic, obviously was a deep tragedy, but if there were silver linings to be gleaned, is that I think it allowed a lot of folks, especially those in the helping profession, to really, have to re-examine their relationship to work and their sort of work-life balance. And, during COVID, I found myself running ragged because our organization had to really quickly pivot from what we normally did to suddenly becoming frontline first response organizations because we were deploying bilingual, multilingual teams into our Chinatown single room occupancy or SRO buildings that had test positive cases in partnership with SF Department of Public Health in order to do testing and info dissemination. There was so much around that time to do. I found myself losing a lot of weight and struggling with health issues, both physical and mental. And I really had to, remind myself, like, what am I doing this for, right? I'm killing myself for what? I had to really remind myself, it's kind of cliche, but that saying that, if you can't be of use and be of service to others if you don't put on your own oxygen mask first, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what I hope that the next generation of API social workers will hopefully, if there were any lessons learned from COVID, that they could take those lessons and lead by example by practicing social work that is grounded on self-care, knowing our limits, knowing when to say no, which I think often is very difficult for API social workers. Um, Knowing when to stop, to strike that balance between being impactful and productive, but also thinking longer term, sustainability and longevity, right? And that is what I hope we'll see in the next generation.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Michael, you've talked so much, not just of hope, but of authenticity and self-care, and just uplifting communities and taking care of each other, and love of family and love of self. If there's one other guiding principle you can you can offer to new API social workers who are committed to decolonizing systems, and you talked about that. Your mom has taught you at a young age about decolonizing systems, right? What would you want them to carry forward?
Yeah, I would say just, collectivism. And collectivism, I don't mean, just within our Chinese or Asian or, Asian Pacific Islander spaces, but broader. I think now more than ever, there's so many forces that are driving divisions.
Mm,
They are pitting, more often than not, pitting communities of color and marginalized communities against each other, all the while distracting us from the fact that the problem really rests within those problematic oppressive systems in the first place, right? Like the
mm,
system of white supremacy and
mm,
so forth.
mhm,
And so, I think it's really important now more than ever for young API professionals to build cross-racial solidarity, as you mentioned earlier, Francis, to build bridges with other movements that are working on similar issues but with different populations,
mhm,
and finding common ground.
mhm,
I've worked with a lot of young API folks who are fearlessly, passionately, committed to working on issues within Chinese and Asian American communities, but sometimes might be minimally aware or might even turn a blind eye to what's happening in other communities, right? In communities of color, folks living with disabilities or LGBTQ plus communities. And I think that collectivism needs to translate to this idea of an attack on any one of us is an attack on all of us,
mhm,
right? And
mhm,
that, I think, we talked about this earlier, but sometimes I think a lot of folks come into this field and say, well, I want to serve my people, right? And I think it has good intentions because we want to get back to the communities that helped us so much, that raised us. But we have to remember that our community isn't one dimensional,
mm,
right? The folks that we serve aren't just Chinese or Asian Americans or Pacific Islanders.
mhm,
They also have intersectional identities. Our communities contain multitudes.
mhm,
And so we have to, not just have one focal point, but we have to, really think beyond the zero sum concept, right? That something that benefits one community does not mean it has to come at the expense of another community.
mhm.
And that, coming together collectively is also the only way we could really dismantle a lot of those oppressive systems.
Mhm. Once again, thank you so much for talking about the importance of collectivism, right? Because we had a conference on Saturday,
Mm.
and we talked about the importance, white America, white supremacy, or white America's greatest trick, right, was pitting all of the communities of color against each other. Because there is such a power in intersectionality, right? There's such a power in when we are able to bridge all our communities together. Because I think with white supremacy, right, that is just something we're able to deconstruct. Because what is the coreness of like the criminal justice system, all that's like poverty or racism or transphobia or homophobia and all these different things, but able to have these hard discussions and able to really examine also like what you and Chris talked about, right? The implicit biases that we may have in ourselves, or also knowing, like you brought up a good, good quote there's a quote I really love by Angela Davis, is that if they come for you in the morning, they'll come for me in the evening, or something like that. I'm probably butchering it, but it's true, is that we're all very connected, right?
Hmm.
Especially in these times where are very, very challenging. So thank you so much for bringing up the importance of not just the importance of community, but importance how we are all very, very connected, and what is happening somewhere else, it can happen to us here, or is also happening to us here. So thank you so
Yeah,
much. The
that's right.
importance of empathy, the
Mm.
importance of empathy and compassion.
Mm.
Yeah, thanks. Um, yeah, our next question is there an API social worker leader you would like us to highlight or interview for a future podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I should share specific names, but I think, one of the things, if I were to make a suggestion, I would
Sure.
say, I know a lot of times in every field, we tend to sort of value and put emphasis on those who have had longevity, who have served a lot of years, and that makes a lot of sense, right? It's like, they have a lot of professional and lived experience, but that also inevitably narrows the field to people who are older age-wise. And so, it would be lovely, I think, to hear maybe a social work leader, an API social work leader who's early in their career, who is just starting out but is also doing amazing work. I think, for a lot of us who are older, sometimes is also difficult for us, like cultural wise, to understand some of the younger generation because, they really grew up differently with a different set of circumstances and environment. And so culturally, there is a generational difference. So, I mean, I think that is also, I think that would be also sort of a great thing to um, kind of that messaging that even if you haven't been in the field for really long, your voice matters too, and that your stories and narratives have a place too. So I would love to see that, and happy to, refer any of the lovely API young leaders who have passed through Nico's over the years to you all, maybe offline,
Mm.
as suggestions.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you for
Thanks,
that.
Michael.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful idea. We have so much to learn from each other. One of the things
Yeah.
I do as a clinical supervisor, right, is that we learn the beauty of social work, the beauty of our
Mm.
profession is that we learn every day.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's right.
we learn, there's so much more we can learn in our profession. We learn about ourselves,
Yes.
from our patients, from each other. There's so much I learn from Chris every day. There's so much
Yes.
I've learned from you, and we've known each other since 2001. There's so much I learned from myself, we're just
Yeah,
so
so
humbled to
true.
have you here, Michael. Just thank you, thank you, thank you so much for all you do for our community and all you do for just being your authentic self. We're so grateful you said you agreed to do this with us, and thank you so much for everything you continue to do.
Yeah, thank you both so much too. And I've looked up to both of you for so long, and thank you for making, creating space for my stories and my sharings today. I really appreciate it and feel really honored to have been part of the series. And so can't wait for, checking out future, podcasts and other great work from the API Social Work Council. Under the leadership of Chris. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks. Yeah, thank you everyone for listening to Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling, a collection of AAPI social work voices presented by the NASW API Social Work Council North.
Yeah.
Please stay tuned for our next episode, which we will be interviewing an API social worker, Deborah Sun, on their work in Stories of Resistance, API social workers changing systems.